My name's Meg Warner and I'm HIV positive, and I've been HIV positive for about 11 and a half years. And part of that experience has been my work with the Positive Speakers Bureau, which I've been doing now for I think 7 or 8 years, quite a long time, and I started on that work quite soon after my initial diagnosis. HIV happened to me in a very unexpected way. I had never really considered myself as being someone who fit into the kind of categories that people expect might be high risk for HIV. I'm a heterosexual woman. I'm currently in my 40s. I was in my 30s when I was first infected. I'm a biblical scholar, a Christian. I like church music and going to movies, so I tend not to fit into any of the kind of categories that people would expect would be likely high risk categories. I was infected in the course of a relationship with a man who I'd known for some time before we began our relationship. I became infected quite early on in that relationship. He didn't believe, or certainly didn't say, that he was HIV positive, and certainly took the view that it came as as much as a surprise to him as it did to me. And I'd been involved already in some programs for HIV awareness before I was infected, and so I spoke about condom use, and I had asked him whether we might go and have some testing before we began our sexual relationship. And unfortunately, he wasn't keen on taking up either of those ideas. He asked me to trust him, essentially, in saying that he was free of any STIs. And unfortunately, I did trust him. And the result, sadly, was that I was infected. The experience of being a speaker with the Bureau has been extraordinary, actually. It's often quite challenging. We speak to such a variety of audiences, sometimes people with very little knowledge about HIV at all, sometimes people with quite a lot of knowledge, actually, who even work in the area, sometimes quite young kids at school, so it's quite a challenge to get the message right at the right level for them. It's also challenging to be vulnerable and speak about something that's so difficult about yourself in front of a large audience. A side effect of being a speaker with the Bureau is that I've become quite used to discussing my sex life in front of large rooms full of strangers. So that's an unusual experience that I've got used to. But quite genuinely, it is a matter of being really quite vulnerable about a difficult experience in front of a number of people. That's hard to do, but in some ways it's also easy because there is such a sense about HIV and what it means that I find that nearly always audiences for the talks are riveted. Not because my story happens to be particularly fascinating, but because they're interested in the subject of HIV, and simply having access to the experience of someone who has that experience, then it's not something that most people ever expect to find for themselves. That telling a story seems to be something that most people respond to quite strongly. So very often as we're talking, you could hear a pin drop. And even if you're talking to a group of grade 3 and 4 students, they could be sitting there watching intently and not mucking around and pulling each other's hair, but absolutely fascinated because this is a story that they'd not really expected to have had access to before. The really positive thing for me personally about being a member of the Bureau is that it's been a fantastic source of support for me personally. So as well as a whole lot of support organisations that exist to help me and make my experience better, this has actually been an opportunity for me to try and give something back to the community and help from out of my experience. And that's actually been the most personally supportive experience for me as well. It's been great. I'm sure that we don't talk enough about HIV in our community, and in particular we don't tell enough stories about it, both In my work in the Bureau and also in my professional work as a biblical scholar, I've become really aware of the power of stories. They really do help us to encapsulate truth and reality in ways that can't be spoken very well more directly. And people respond to stories. They enjoy hearing stories. And I think that stories are a fantastic way to get a message across and to help people understand things that they hadn't had reason to get their heads around before. HIV is just another disease, but it has to do with sex and it has to do with death and with drugs and in some people's minds with prostitution. And I think that that's a really, really heady mix. And that's the source of the problem. Otherwise, I think HIV is just really quite boring these days in many ways. It's a chronic, treatable, manageable condition, but the fact that it has to do with sex and death just makes it so much more complicated. Issues around disclosure and trust are extremely difficult in a whole range of relationships, but particularly when it comes to intimate relationships. It's very difficult to judge when the right time is to make disclosure. Some people take the view that you should do it first up. So if there's a first date, that's the time to disclose. Others say that you should wait significantly longer and allow some time to see whether the relationship might have some possibility in it to go forward before you broach that issue. For me, I think it's always been something that I've dealt with relationship by relationship and just seeing where that question came up. Really, there have only been 2 occasions for me where I've had to broach it with someone who I hoped was then going to become a partner. And I've been extraordinarily lucky. It's gone well both times. But it's not at all easy to do. And it's frightening because you don't know how that person will respond. You don't know whether they may reject you just simply on the basis of HIV status. You don't know the extent to which that's going to become difficult and problematic in the context of the relationship. The message that I would really want to send, I think, to Australian society in general is that being HIV positive need not be a bar to living a full and rich and healthy life. We're so fortunate that our resources means that living with HIV can entirely be compatible with living fully and living richly and energetically and in a way that contributes back to our society. Not everyone is fortunate enough to be in a position to be well and to have all the resources that they need. But HIV is not a death sentence, and nor is it something that tells you that you will not have a future. We're really lucky, and HIV is an illness just like any other. Despite the really good experiences that I've had since being diagnosed and the fact that I've really not had to suffer too much discrimination, unfortunately my story isn't the same as the story of all men and women who are diagnosed HIV positive in Melbourne and in Australia and around the world. And an awful lot of us have to deal with situations of discrimination and stigma that get in the way of work, that get in the way of relationships, that get in the way of being able to live an ordinary day-to-day life and being seen and treated by other people as simply one of them. And that kind of stigma and discrimination is just another and unnecessary level of suffering that people living with HIV need to deal with in their daily lives. It's unnecessary, and it would be great if the Enough campaign can really make strides in persuading people that we've had enough stigma and that just because HIV tends to be associated in our minds with sex and death and drugs, that it doesn't actually make it a disease which is different in nature from other forms of disease, that we seem to be able to speak about and to deal with in a more sensible way and without building those same kind of levels of stigma.